Hi folks, and welcome to part 2 of the seam series. In this video we're going to look at 3 additional techniques evidenced in the Viking Age. We're going to look at a bound or butted seam, a lapped seam, and finally a rolled fell or stand-up seam. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, it's linked up there. It's well worth a watch of that first, because not only will it give you the foundation techniques for Viking Age sewing, but we also talk about stitch size and spacing for different types of fabrics and the reasons why we use seam treatments and don't just leave our raw edges to unravel. If you've got the hang of the basic 3 stitches from the Viking Age, the whip stitch, the running stitch and the back stitch, then you're ready for these seams. If you need some help with those stitches, check out this video because that will take you through the technique for those. Right, let's go and have a look at these seams, shall we? Okay, the first technique that we're going to look at today is referred to as a butted or bound seam. It looks like this on the right side. Flip over here, you can see on the wrong side it looks very similar to the split or flat fell we've already learned. However, you'll notice that this initial line of stitching is done with whip stitches rather than a running stitch or a back stitch. Bound seams are worked directly along the edge of the fabric. Whip stitch along the 2 folded sides here. And then you finish your seam allowances however you choose. On linen, it will almost always look like this because you need to finish these raw edges. Here's an example on wool. These edges you wouldn't need to turn as they're not likely to fray. You'd still want to whip stitch them down. You can see here how the 2 edges are folded back. And here is an example of a bound seam where the selvage edges have been used so that there's absolutely no seam allowance showing on either side. So you would join the 2 selvage edges together like this and whip stitch along the top. To prepare your fabric, you begin with the fabric facing right sides together, as we've done with the simple run and fell and the split fell. I just pop a little line of pins in there, just so I've got room to manipulate this part at the top to get my seam allowances in the right place. Remember, if you're working with linen, you're going to need to leave enough that you can double turn it at the end. On wool it's not so important because you can fell it down raw, as we did with the split fell on wool. But for linen you absolutely need to leave enough seam allowance to turn. Again, I usually use about 10mm, half an inch, when I'm making my seam allowances for any seam, because it just gives you plenty of room to work with. So what I'm going to do first is just pop a couple of clips in like that. Get my first seam allowance turned. Then what we need to do is match up this second one. Now this seam is a lot easier for me to do with clips, but if you only have pins, you do exactly the same process. You pin one side first and then you match the other side up and add your pins back in. I'm going to leave these in place, these extra ones at the bottom, as I sew, just to keep everything in the right place. Okay, so once you're all clipped and pinned in place and you're happy, you're ready to start sewing. Bound seam is sewn with a whip stitch just along this raw edge here. Sorry, this turned edge in this case. It would be a raw edge if you were using selvages, but we're not today. So we're going to make exceedingly small stitches again to keep it nice and strong along the edge here. Now with a bound seam you want to be working as close as you can to this edge. You only want to catch a few threads, and I'll show you an example of why in just a moment, but for now I'm just going to do a few of these nice little whip stitches to get started, and then I'll show you why these need to be as close to the edge as you can make them while still catching enough of the fabric to be strong. On this example piece here, I've done a range of different stitch depths. You can see these ones are extremely small and only catch a few of the threads with each stitch. These ones aren't a great deal larger, it's only 2 or 3 more threads per stitch. But if we unfold this and have a look at the right side, you can see there the difference. That's the very, very shallow stitches, and these are the ones that are just a little bit wider. As I pull that, you can see how much more this gapes as well than the small stitches. So just that millimetre, 2 millimetres, makes a huge difference in your finished product when you're working with a bound seam. That's why we do the teeny tiny stitches. You can see on this example here, this is the example worked along the selvage of the fabric where we don't have any seam allowance at all. The stitches are exceedingly small again, but because there is no seam allowance whatsoever, you will see more of them on the right side. That's inevitable with this type of stitch. However, you can see, giving that a good tug, it's extremely strong. It's one of the benefits of working with a selvage, if you have the historically accurate selvage anyway. If you don't, you might want to use the turned edge technique instead. If you had a selvage that had a tablet woven border, for example, that could be an excellent technique to use because you're not going to hide any of that tablet woven border. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this type of seam would normally be unfolded and laid flat after sewing. You've then got multiple choices for finishing these raw edges. You can either whip stitch the 2 seam allowances flat, like a split fell, either rolling it under to stop it fraying or leaving it raw if it's a wool. On heavily felted wools, you can leave the raw edges untreated if you wish, just leave them like this, without securing them down at all. Generally, I like to do something with them to encourage them to lay where I want them to, if nothing else. Hello! Editing Weirdling here, just hopping in with this Skjoldehamn Hood. This is one notable exception to bound seams being spread open flat after they've whip stitched. And this is where a bound seam is used along the top and down the back of the Skjoldehamn Hood, securing these seams as part of this coxcomb effect along the top and the back of the hood. Here, the raw edges are bound on the inside. Instead of doing the seam on the outside, these are done from the top, and this line of running stitch here, which is a shaping stitch that helps give this stand-up effect to the hood top, just binds everything together and goes through all the seam allowances as well as the main fabric. There's 2 layers underneath as well, which we'll talk about more in a later video, but that means that when the hood is worn, you get this stand-up effect here. It's a really, really handy technique in this version if you actually want a stand-up seam on your clothing. For whatever reason, you may wish to have one. There is an example on the Skjoldehamn Hood. So now I'm just finishing off these last few stitches on this bound seam. Nearly done. Now, as you've just seen, this stitch is absolutely brilliant for the top of hoods and things like that. It's also great for repairs. Now, in part 1 of the seam series, I showed you a quick repair that I did on with a bound seam on a split-felled side seam that had come undone. And there we have our initial line of stitching on our bound seam. This is what you've got on the inside of the garment. I could leave these raw edges as they are. I could whip stitch them down. What I can even do, should I wish to, is pinch them together like that and then just bind those edges together. It's a little bit awkward, but it is one option. When we turn to the right side of the fabric, this is what you'll see. If you've got those stitches nice and small, nice and close to that edge there, as we were sewing, just right along the edge, what you'll have when you turn over again is this really nice seam. Now there will be a tiny bit of the stitching visible. That's unavoidable with a bound seam. As I showed you right at the beginning, this is the version on linen with the seam allowances finished nicely. You do exactly the same with the whip stitches on a woolen garment there, just to hold that down, but you don't need to turn it. Bound seams can be absolutely brilliant in cases where you need to make a repair on a piece of clothing. So for example, this is the side seam on your tunic or dress, and some of this stitching here has burst, has come loose and has come and unravelled. What you don't want to have to do is to unpick all of these side seams as well, so that you can redo the seam exactly as it was in the beginning. What you can do is simply fold those together and use your bound seam along the top edge there. That's what I did with that dress that I showed you before. It's also really helpful if you're joining fabrics that have lovely selvage edges, where you don't want any extra bulk in the seam, but it doesn't give the neatest finish or have the extra strength of a run and fell seam. So on balance, it's one of those ones that's handy to use, but be thoughtful in how you use it. Okay, our second seam today is the lapped seam. So named because the fabric is overlapped before sewing, like so, rather than being laid right side to right side and then sewing. You simply overlap the two and then whip stitch down on each side to keep the seam edges laying flat. This method is really useful when patching clothing, for example, and it can also be used to insert gores into garments, with a slight variation in how these seam allowances are arranged before sewing. It can be particularly helpful if you're making something that needs to be weatherproof. We've got lap seams from Hedeby, from Norway on the Skjoldehamn Hood, many others. It's quite a ubiquitous type of seam, and there's a few different ways that it can be done. So we're going to look at that today. But your basic tenet with a lapped seam is that the fabric will be overlapped and sewn down, rather than sewn right sides facing to begin with. If you're working with a wool that won't fray, you can choose to simply lay the pieces over one another, like so, pin down the middle to keep it from wiggling about, and whip stitch. However, for a neater finish or on fabrics which fray, you need to turn your raw edges under before sewing down, so we're going to look at that now. So, normally when we begin stitching, we put right side to right side, sew a seam, and voila. What we're doing this time is we're going to overlap. So remember, with linen you need to turn each edge under, so you need to make sure you overlap by enough that you've got enough to turn under on both sides. So that looks about right to me, so I'm just going to flip it, check that I'm happy. Bit wonky, that linen, but that's okay. So what we're going to do now is quickly pop a couple of pins in the middle, just to hold our two pieces where we want them. And then we're going to turn under the edges on both sides, pin both sides down before we start working, so that at the end we have exactly what we want. Okay, that's our initial pin done. If we flip it, that's what the other side's going to look like. So first of all, we're going to turn under our top piece, move our pin out and into place there. You're going to need a few more pins as we go along. that initial one, you could just move it. These are all still holding it in place nicely where you want it to be. Move that one back a little way to give me a bit more room. Keep it nice and even as you're pinning. Make sure you're not coming over too much. And that's your first side pinned. Then you flip over. You've got to do the same again on this side. Okay, that's very roughly pinned. It's also quite roughly folded as well. What you can do before you start is turn your seam allowance and press it exactly how you want it, so that when you lay the other piece of fabric over the top, you're simply ready to line them up and sew. If you're working on something that needs to be particularly neat at the end, that's a really good way of doing it. What we need to do now, and I won't show you all this on camera because you have got the hang of watching me whip stitch by now, is whip stitch all the way down this side and all the way down this side. And then we will have something that very much resembles the woolen example I showed you at the beginning, except with turned under edges to protect the linen from fraying. So I'll be back in a minute and we'll see what that looks like. Ta-da! One lapped seam. Very much resembles this first example I had on wall here, except with the turned edge. Looks exactly the same on both sides. Both lines of whip stitching visible on both sides of the fabric, like that. Now before we move on, there's a couple more things I want to show you about lapped seams because they're really handy little things. Not only for repairing clothing, patches and things like that, very, very simple way to cover a piece of damaged cloth, but they also have a couple more uses that it's worth knowing about. I mentioned before about how to make an extremely strong and weather resistant lapped seam. So what you can do, if you start with your pieces of fabric, one side right way up, one side wrong way up. So say for example this is our right side of this piece, our right side of the second piece will be underneath here. You press back your seam allowances before you start, so you've got those equal. That's important that these be as equal as possible on both pieces. It's much easier to achieve this if you press them before you start. So once you've got your seam allowances pressed back, to put the seam together, what you're going to do is take this piece here, just unfold slightly, line this seam allowance up exactly with this fold here. Be a little bit tricky to get spot on, but you want it as absolutely close in as is humanly possible. Then you fold that seam allowance down over there. Fold back to the front and then pin. Obviously check you're happy that everything's in place first, but I am with this one because I pressed it first, so I know exactly how wide they are. And what you end up with here is this lovely interlock whereby both seam allowances wrap around one another on the inside of the lapped seam. This means that when you do your two lines of whip stitching along this line here and along that line there, what you're doing is effectively going through 4 layers of fabric each time. With the original lapped seam, these seam allowances only came to the middle on each side, so you were going through the base fabric and the turn there and catching 3 layers. With this one, you're catching 4 layers with every whip stitch, and the overlap means that it's really, really hard for wind and for water to get through it. So it's really, really good for things that need to be wind resistant, for example, generally weather resistant. It makes a really, really strong seam. Another way that a lapped seam can be really, really helpful is when you're inserting front and rear gores into garments. So inset gores, as you can work it from the right side from the very beginning, which makes it a bit easier to see what you're doing. If you're sewing gores in from this side, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky, especially when you're starting. So using a lapped seam here can be really helpful. Now you see that's where the two pieces of fabric have overlapped, and on this wool it's a little bit liable to fray, so I've turned it under here. And what I'm going to show you is how you can make almost invisible whip stitches on this kind of lapped seam. So as you can see on this side, with this technique you can get the stitches almost invisible. Now I've made them obviously with this bright orange thread, they're quite noticeable. However, what you can do is come in just under your seam line to attach to your base fabric, and then just catch a few threads at the bottom half of this turn, and then as you come through you barely see the stitching. So there's just what your normal stitch line would be. You're going to come just back inside it to catch the base fabric, and then you're going to come up and out just on the bottom there, just to the side, to complete your whip stitch. It looks quite different, this version of whip stitching, but it can be one of the benefits of working from the front of the work with a lapped seam over the standard way of doing it as a run and fell or a flat fell, where you join the right sides together. This is a period technique. A lot of the Skjoldehamn garments were sewn from the front, not quite in this fashion, but sewing seams like this rather than working on the backs all the time is a perfectly acceptable period technique. So there we have sewn from the front, almost invisible seam with matching thread. You'd hardly notice these stitches at all. Again, we've gone for about 3 per centimetre because we're working on wool, and when you turn over you can see what you're left with is this other side of the lapped seam raw, just turning that under for fabrics that need it. They're going to fray. Now, as I said, I usually use a run and fell seam for my gores. Opus Eleni has a fantastic video on her channel for her technique for inserting front and rear gores, which I've used many times now. I've popped a link to that video in the description for you. If you haven't found her channel yet, it's well worth checking out. There's lots of useful bits and bobs on there. Now I'm going to show you what this can look like on a heavily felted wool where you don't need to turn the seams. Here we have our absolutely lovely heavily felted wool that doesn't like to fray. If you have wool like this, as you can see here, I've just overlapped those two quite closely, in fact, because you don't need a great deal of space if you're working with fabric that's not going to fray at all like this. One of the benefits of a lapped seam in this situation is that it keeps the seam exceedingly thin. If you can imagine the extra thickness involved with 2 layers of turned hem for that wool, it's pretty chunky. For something like a gore, where you want it to lay nicely and flat to the body and not have odd lumps and bumps in it or uncomfortable seams that could rub, a lapped seam for gore insertion like this is really, really helpful. You can see closely here, you keep your stitches nice and close together. If you're not turning, it's even more important to stitch closely. At weak points, you can come in and add an awful lot more teeny tiny stitches to support the top of the gore there. And this situation is one where a decorative reinforcing stitch like this makes a lot of sense, because not only are you covering this visible raw edge, but you're making that incredibly strong. On the back here, you can see I have felled down this extra edge here. You don't actually have to, but to get it laying nice and flat, to be most comfortable and most hard wearing, you would again fell down that seam allowance. That there is the herringbone stitch from the mamming cushion, and the version found covering seams on the Skjoldehamn tunic around the neckline. It's a really, really lovely little stitch to use in that situation. Okay, the final seam that we have today is this one, the rolled or stand-up seam. This seam is a variation on standard felling, which leaves no whip stitches visible on the outside. This is the seam I mentioned in the first video in the section on simple seams with a bound edge. It has the simplicity on the right side of the fabric that seam treatment gives you, but with the added bonus you get from a run and fell seam, because you have the strength bonus of rolling the fabrics together, plus an additional line of stitching, this one here, going through all the pieces. Except here the secondary stitching is worked just behind the first line of stitching instead of all the way across the seam allowance. To make this type of seam, you start your fabrics by sewing right sides facing. Put your two right sides together, and then sew with your choice of running or back stitch. You can see here that I've sewn this initial seam just set back a little way from the piece that's going to be rolled over it. You don't have to do this. In fact, with linen sometimes it's easier not to. It'll just depend on your individual piece of fabric. Some people find that this is a useful way to save fabric on all sorts of seams where you sew right sides together. Personally, I like to leave equal seam allowance for most of them, because it can make things easier when you have to manipulate multiple seam allowances at join points. But if you have a really simple seam that you're sewing, you can just offset the fabric slightly instead of trimming this bit back at the end. That's up to you. Now, to prepare this seam allowance, what you're going to do, you're going to roll this up. Tuck it right under like that, all the way along. So what you've got is a little sausage. Now with wool, you only need to roll it over just to there, all the way down like that. And you're going to be whip stitching just inside here. If this was linen, you'd need to leave a little bit more, because you'd need to fold it over once, then again. Now whether you fold or roll is up to you. The final seam that you'll achieve is very similar either way. So I'm going to get that pinned where I want it, and then I will show you the stitching technique to make sure that you don't see whip stitches on the outside of this seam once it's finished. Now as you can see, I'm starting pinning. Instead of pinning it with the other side folded out, I'm pinning it along its edges, because what you don't want to do is catch this fabric underneath as you pin. Okay, so what you're going to do when you're sewing this seam treatment is keep your two main pieces of fabric well out of the way, so that when you're stitching, you're never going to come through the fabric that's showing on the right side. All of this work is done on the individual seam allowance here behind this initial layer of stitching. So what you'll end up having is two layers of joining stitches, your initial line here, and then these whip stitches just behind that are tidying up the seam allowance, but keeping it from showing on the outside. Now, when you've got a linen or a rolled hem here that's rolled all the way under, you'll have a turned edge here, so it means you can catch an even tinier amount of the stitches here. With a single turned wool, you need to catch a little bit more. What you do is you come in at an angle, just like that, catching the entirety of this seam allowance and a little bit of this rolled piece at the top. It's a lot easier in some ways with linen because you've got the entire roll there to work with. Come in always just behind this layer of stitching here, catching this down, securing everything nicely together. As you can see as I'm sewing here, this one is a little bit trickier than the other, but it's a good one to have in your skill set should you need it. If you're working with a turned hem like this, what you can also do is pop the initial part of the whip stitch in just behind your seam line here, and then move across like that. Catch that loop. Show you that again. Instead of going diagonally straight across, you can go in, up, then loop under to catch down a little bit more of your fabric. And this will help give a more tubular effect. You can see on this one it's tubular, but it's also only tubular from there because it's bound there, so this little bit at the top is a tube, this bit isn't. Using this version of the technique gives you a much more tubular finish. You can even, if you wish, if you've done a running stitch for your initial stitch, match the stitches as closely as you can before coming through. And then you'll end up with all this area double stitched exactly. You don't have to do that, but it's another way to keep things neat and add a little bit of strength if you wish. But always make sure you're working to the left of that stitch line. Or if you're right-handed, the other way around, but behind it on the side that won't show. And there we have a rolled or stand-up seam. The stand-up roll created by this technique will stand up to wear better than simply binding the raw edges, as all those raw edges are tucked down or inside. But again, it's one of those that may be best for used for outer garments rather than those which will directly touch your skin, as it will be raised slightly. You could choose to press it flat after sewing to minimise this and make your roll as small as possible, but it will pop up to some degree whatever you do. You can see those little whip stitches there just behind the seam line all the way along. Either technique that we talked about will give you the same tubular effect at the end of the seam. Okay, see the little roll, it's flat at the moment because it's just been sewed, but it will pop up. If I show you just here on this open end of the linen, this was rolled properly with both seam allowances untrimmed, rolled all the way around so it's fully encased, and then whip stitched down. So you're just catching with the whip stitch the very edge of this roll, and that gives you that even more tubular shape as you sew. Here's what our back looks like. And when we flip it, this is what the front looks like. Absolutely no whip stitching visible, and this is the main benefit of this technique over flat felling directly and sewing along the line on this part if for any reason you want a seam with no other whip stitches showing. Firstly, we have our bound seam. This is a seam that's sewn worked on its end like that. Very, very handy for making repairs, things like that. This is our example on wool where the raw edges are just felled flat without turning. And on the right side it'll look something like this. If you keep those stitches nice and shallow, you'll end up with very little showing on the right side. This is our example on linen with those raw edges of the seam allowance turned under before whip stitching. This is the right side, and again you can just about see tiny elements of that stitching coming through on that side. This is where the bound seam's disadvantage is over the flat fell that we looked at in the first video. Because on this seam you don't see any stitching at all on the main seam line. You just see the little whip stitches securing down those seam allowances. Again, this one's very, very handy for repairs, things like that, because it doesn't involve having to undo this seam allowance in order to make a strong and effective repair. Secondly, we have our lapped seam. This is the seam where the pieces of fabric are laid over one another rather than being sewn right sides together, and each side of the lap is secured down with whip stitches to stop it from fraying. Here we have our lapped seam on linen with those raw edges turned under. The seams look the same on both sides of the fabric. And here is the finished version of that one I showed you that's extra strong. This one here, you can just see the 4 layers of fabric there and how well they're secured down. It does make for a slightly thicker seam, but it will be very, very much stronger. That's not going anywhere. This is our example of the lapped seam used to set an inset gore. So a gore in the middle of the front or the back of your tunic, for example, or you haven't got a seam to secure it into, but you want to keep things as nice and flat as possible. On this wool that doesn't fray, you don't even have to turn with this technique. Excellent place for a little bit of decorative stitching. Woohoo! And here, an example of using the lap technique with a gore that requires a turned edge, so on a lightweight or easily fraying wool or linen. If we look on the bottom there, you can see how those seam allowances are folded under and slightly overlapped in this one. Both sides of the work. Again, the edges are completely sealed. And finally, we have our stand-up or rolled seam. This is a seam where we roll over the seam allowances, secure the raw edges, and use very small whip stitches just along this stitch line behind there, so that we end up with no whip stitching visible on the right side of the work. Here's our linen example, where you can see the stitches running along the edge there, just going down back onto the seam allowance of the original seam line, where everything is well rolled before it's secured down. And there we go. You've learnt 3 more of the stitching techniques from the Viking Age that you can use in creating your garments. Lovely. Before I finish up today, I want to talk a little bit about the variations we have in seam techniques and in stitching. Now, there are as many combinations of running stitch, whip stitch, back stitch, in rolled fells, bound seams, lapped seams, any way that you can think really of applying these stitches to these seams probably has been done at some point. There are huge variations in what we find in the evidence. Some of them are particularly creative. So I don't make these videos to tell you this is how it must be done. Not at all. My aim is to give you the options, to go through the core techniques, talk about pros and cons of each one and how you might want to use it, and help you to achieve that stitch at the end of the day. How you choose to use that as a creator is up to you, the same way it was for Viking Age people, adapting to their needs and the qualities of their fabric 1,000 years ago. If you're here just to learn a few seams to keep your clothing holding up and lasting well, brilliant, we've got you covered. If you want to get a bit more creative and neat with your repairs, maintain your kit for longer, also all of these techniques are going to come in handy for you. Finally, if you're somebody who wants to recreate a garment exactly as it was found, with all the seams and stitches as we have them, then having practiced these techniques is going to stand you in really good stead as you dig into the research and try and work out what on earth was going on. Some of them are incredibly complicated. If you've made a V-Borg shirt, then all hail you, because I'm not worthy. That thing is confusing. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you very much for spending your time with me again. I hope you found it helpful. And I've got a question for you. What is your favourite seam technique? What do you find yourself reaching for the most often? For me, I think it's probably the humble run and fell, because it is so useful and so strong. But what about you? What's your favourite technique so far? Or have you got another one that I haven't covered yet? I'm very interested to hear about that. Don't forget to check out the research links in the description of this video. There's links to PDFs, websites and videos on there, including that one of Opus Elena's that I mentioned earlier. It's a really great place to start jumping off from for further research into these techniques and lots of other lovely things about Viking clothing. Pop me a like if you found the video helpful, and I will see you soon, lovely folks.